Bernard Marszalek, 83, living now in Berkeley. I was born in Chicago. So I was born in a working class family. My father was a steel worker. My mother worked at Western Electric, which had a plant just outside Chicago, which was huge. It was the Google of the age, in the sense that all the telephones in America were manufactured in this plant. So both my parents had factory jobs. And I grew up in a neighborhood which was, I guess, mainly working class. And that, I think, influenced me a lot. I can bring that up later because I think it's what I did later in my life and the people I associated later in my life were essentially from the same sort of background in Chicago. So, and I didn't have a St. Paul moment with anarchism. It kind of grew out of my working class background, I think. It wasn't so foreign to me to understand class structure, which wasn't true for a lot of people who may have grown up in a more middle class or even upper class environment. So that's kind of my immediate background. It may seem strange, but as I said, I came out of a background where I was so familiar with class structures. And so therefore it made sense that I would gravitate towards, when I was a little kid, towards something like Bugs Bunny, the cartoon, which was Bugs Bunny was really an anarchist in many ways. And Elmer Fudd was the typical bourgeois. So, that kind of made a lot of sense to me. But I think the first real introduction to alternative ways of looking at life was with Mad Magazine. That might sound strange because Mad Magazine went through some changes in I think maybe early 60s, but when I first came across it in the 50s, it was partly a graphics magazine, excuse me, partly a graphics magazine, but also had actually texts, articles, satiric articles, but people like Ernie Kovacs contributed to it. And this was a comic in the 50s, early 60s, into TV actually. But I think that had a great effect on me because I liked to draw a lot. I seem to sort of self-taught myself portrait drawing. And when I was in high school, I produced a little satiric magazine based on the drawings in Mad Magazine. So I was satirizing the teachers. I went to a Catholic grammar school and to a Catholic high school in Chicago. High school was taught by Christian brothers. Unfortunately, I could only make one copy of this because I had no way of duplicating what I was doing. And so I would bring it to school. People would pass it around. At some point, it got snatched up by one of the professors, one of the teachers. And of course, I was disciplined by being thrown out of the college prep program into the secretarial program, which was actually a boon because I met Bill Granger there in the secretarial stream in junior year. And he was a journalist on the school paper. In his senior year, he became the editor, and he made me the satiric editor. So I wrote a couple of satirical pieces, which I can't remember the content of, but they were less strident than my own production that got picked up by the authorities. So Bill Granger actually went into becoming a journalist on the Sun-Times and eventually a columnist. But he was a close friend of mine in high school. So from high school, I took a year break. All through high school, telling my family and friends that I was going to be an architect. And I got into IIT, Illinois Institute of Technology, after high school. But then I realized I'd be stuck there for 5 years and basically into an engineering program as opposed to an architectural program. I was very much impressed by Frank Lloyd Wright, who was I don't know how you describe, it's kind of a celebrity architect, I guess. He proposed a mile-high building outside Chicago, for example, which would be totally fantastic if you can imagine it, a mile-high building, 5,200 and some feet tall. How many stories would that be? Like 500 or something. And but he also built homes that really were impressive. And in Chicago, if you actually visit Chicago, you can take tours of the homes that he built. And he built a few out here in California too. He built this in Marin County. He built the Civic Center, and taking a walk through that Civic Center plaza is like going through an early science fiction set, because the way it was structured and so forth was so typical of the, I don't know what we would say, a Flash Gordon kind of movie or something. Everything was kind of rounded and soft looking, and there was, anyway, it was, so he was very impressed. I was very impressed by him, and I decided to take a year off because I didn't want to go to a engineering school for 5 years, and found myself at the Sun-Times, the local newspaper, the liberal newspaper in Chicago, the Sun-Times. The radical one, the Republican one was the Tribune. And I got to be a copy boy there in the features department, and then moved into becoming an editorial assistant. So my editorial assistant job was writing the TV listings for all the neighborhood communities around Chicago that received the Sun-Times on a Sunday. It was an intriguing job because I really got the experience of what journalism was all about. I mean, I was moving around from one department to the other, taking galleys down to the press operators. It was really an eye-opening experience to be around in an environment like that. And I got to appreciate throughout my whole life, journalism and the free press and the First Amendment issues. I think it came out of that early experience with the newspaper. Well, after several months of doing that, in the summer I quit and started 3 semesters at Loyola University, a Catholic school in Chicago, and joined the Student Peace Union at that point. The Student Peace Union preceded the Students for Some Democratic Society. It was actually the venue for fighting the beginnings of the Vietnam War. And this is like in the early 60s. And Loyola wasn't a very political school, and I was probably the only person who had any kind of political interest. To back up a little bit, before I got into Loyola, that year I was off, and even before, when I was still in high school, I came upon it sounds strange because they don't exist. I don't think they exist anymore, but they did exist in cities later. In fact, I know there's one in Oakland, here in California. I'm in Berkeley. So this smoke shop had smoking equipment in the front, I mean, pipes and so forth. Then it had a large room in the back where there were magazines. Half the room was pornographic magazines. The other half of the room were legitimate, Popular, Atlantic, and Harper's Week, all the magazines that would be in any reasonable bookstore. But on top of that, it had at the bottom of the rows of the legitimate magazines, political literature that people would bring in on consignment. And this was like a hub of information. For me, it was a revelation because someone was dropping off Freedom Press, which was the British journal, a weekly newspaper, or maybe it was bi-weekly, I don't remember. And so that's where I first picked up anarchist literature. And I also got a taste of Trotskyist literature, Stalinist bullshit, and everything else. But, it's pretty easy to gravitate towards Freedom Press because it just seemed to resonate with me as just like so reasonable. And at that point, I started communicating and writing with Colin Ward. Colin Ward produced a journal, a monthly journal called Anarchy. It's a beautiful small magazine, maybe 36 pages or so. But it it had various. It would sometimes be a topic, and there would be a theme to the magazine. But there are various articles, and each one I read it from page to page because it was just so intriguing and eye-opening in terms of the vast reach of anarchist concerns. I mean, again, I was interested in architecture, so architecture was covered, but science was covered. It was a wonderful introduction to the breadth of anarchist thinking. And Colin Ward was not a sectarian, because there was also the sectarian individualist anarchist literature I came across and the anarchist syndicalist stuff. But it was Colin Ward who influenced me the most in terms of what I thought anarchism was all about. He and Paul Goodman, because the first hardcover book I bought when I was 17 was Growing Up Absurd. And Paul Goodman, that book was actually, it was a strange one. I'm not going to go into the history of it, but it was rejected something like, I think, 17 times by publishers. And finally, Grove Press took it, and it was kind of a maverick publisher at the time. And that book, I think, just sold thousands and thousands of copies. It made Paul Goodman the celebrity he became in terms of a spokesperson for liberatory thinking. He did call himself an anarchist, but mainly I think he called himself a libertarian, and the old school libertarian, not the current libertarianism, which was basically anarcho-communism or something. Anarcho-capitalism. So Paul Goodman and Colin Ward were my early influences in terms of anarchism. In terms of my political activity, it was Student Peace Union, the revolt against the beginnings of the war in Vietnam. After 3 semesters, I had enough of Catholic teaching and left. In the meantime, I got in touch with Catholic Worker, which was another anarchist influencing aspect of my introduction to anarchists, because I was no longer a Catholic, but I appreciated their sense of doing good work and doing it irrespective of grant money or financial aid from the government. They just went off and did it, fed people. They were the precursor to Food Not Bombs, for example. They were the people who are actually housing people, bringing them up and providing shelter for people, feeding them. And that was a great introduction to the practical aspects of what anarchists could do. So after that 3 semesters of Valoda, I started working in various shops. Now, because of the war beginning, it was pretty easy to get a job. And of course, the easiest jobs were the terrible shit jobs that people would hate that worked at. So I worked at a number of them and got a real taste of what the least skilled and most desperate people have to put up with. I mean, I worked with immigrants in factories that were just hellholes. Of course, I didn't have to stay there. I could leave. I was single. I hadn't raised a family. I still living at my parents' house, so I didn't have to stay. But I had experiences that I think were really eye-revealing. Opened my eyes in terms of what people had to put up with. I mean, my father worked at a steel warehouse, but he worked at a stainless steel warehouse, which is the highest rung of that sort of commodity. Worked on very technical machines, cutting the steel and so forth. So he was a highly skilled laborer and in the union. So he had, good pay. You could raise a family on a single pay. But not people I worked with in warehouses and factories and so forth were not at that level. They were unorganized and desperate people. So anyway, there was a school in Chicago which was formed, a university which was formed by teachers leaving the YMCA college in Chicago, which had a quota for blacks. These teachers didn't like that and rebelled against it and were kicked out. And so they formed their own university called the Roosevelt, of course, after FDR. And Roosevelt University was the quintessential working class urban college or university. I think it'd be similar to SUNY in New York, a college that was financed by a public finance school. This wasn't. This was privately financed, but it was um, established on a very radical premise. So it wasn't unusual that I would find people there who would sort of think along the ways I was thinking. Um, and this was the first time I actually encountered people. I mean, for example, Lionel Batari, who's still around, lives in Chicago, who was the director of the Anti-Poetry Club. Now, here's a university that had a Dada student group. So I got involved with surrealism, but just historically, chronologically, my first introduction to that kind of rebellious art movement was Dada. Um, and then, of course, I met Tor Faegre, who uh, was a now, Tor came out of a very interesting background. He was an activist back on the East Coast. His parents split up, and he was living with his mother on the East Coast. And at the age of 17, 16, 17, when I was just fooling around reading stuff, he was actually in a kayak trying to stop submarines from being built in Groton, Connecticut. So he had a very activist background very early. He moved to Chicago. His father was teaching at Roosevelt, so he moved back to Chicago. His father was living in a co-op community, and so Tor took up residence, and I met him at Roosevelt. And Tor and I began talking about what we wanted to do. He was still living with his father in this co-op community, and I was at my parents'. So we said, well, we should find an apartment or something. And I said, well, I wanted to start a bookstore. Maybe we could find a storefront and live in the back. And we did. We found one in the Old Town area of Chicago on Armitage. And Tor had some skills in terms of construction. And his friend, who's also at Roosevelt, Bob Green, came out of Wisconsin, out of a farm labor kind of background, had skills with carpentry. They built a loft in the back of the storefront. So the front of the storefront was a bookshop, kind of a strange bookshop. I can tell you a little bit about it. But in the back, it was a loft. I slept in the loft. Tor slept downstairs. They added there was a bathroom in the back, of course. They added plumbing for a kitchen. So we had a little apartment back there. So so that was the origin of Solidarity Bookshop. I also met the Rosemonts, Franklin and Penny at Roosevelt, and numerous other people. We started the bookshop. I got in touch with the British, because since I already had been in touch with Colin Ward, got in touch with all the British magazines and so forth. So we had all the literature from England. Franklin and Penny got in touch with some French and Danish contacts. So the surrealist journals would come in. So we had a bookshop which was filled with not only literature from obscure groups all over the world, but also we had, since we only lived, the store was only a few blocks away from the headquarters of the Industrial Workers of the World in Chicago, we picked up a lot of the books they had just sitting on shelves, who just nobody ever saw them. We took them to the bookstore. So we had literature going back from the 20s and 30s, plus this current, ephemera from Europe and so forth, and from the United States too. But the bookstore grew into a larger project in terms of producing a magazine. We produced The Rebel Worker there. The Rebel Worker was an IWW Chicago branch journal. It was ostensibly anarcho-syndicalist, but it was more a cultural journal, if anything. It had articles on current events and so forth, and then the sort of historic relevance of the IWW and its current relevance. But it had issues on cultural, reviews of cultural issues too, and it was a strong emphasis on surrealism. So now my attraction to surrealism was based on its politics. I definitely saw whole emphasis in the surrealists of avoiding work as just this gives, especially since I had all this experience in these terrible jobs. Of course, I'd want to avoid work. I mean, there was no sense in surrealists had also a political sense. Now, the Dadaists and the surrealists, this is interesting because the Dadaists, like Bataille in Roosevelt, saw the surrealists as Stalinists because for a while they allied with the Communist Party. But that didn't last very long. They got kicked out of the Communist Party, and then they sort of gravitated towards Trotskyism. But nonetheless, they had a very political stance in terms of their influence in the cultural affairs. So they didn't see themselves as simply a bunch of alienated artists or cultural workers or something. They saw themselves as having a political effect in France and in the wider universe, since the movement actually had branches all over the world after a while. So let's see. So that brings me up to the bookshop Rebel Worker. I could go on. Do you want me to go on and explain a little more of that? So after about almost 2 years of being in touch with the bookshop and doing the Rebel Worker, now the Rebel Worker was, so we actually saw the Rebel Worker not simply as a magazine that would be distributed to bookshops and distributed across the country to stores and so forth, but we actually took it into the streets. So there was we lived not too close, well, I shouldn't say we lived, but the group lived in the same sort of neighborhood as a major alternative entertainment venue where folk music places were set up and or restaurants and so forth. This is the part of the Old Town section of Chicago, because it was part of the oldest part of Chicago. And there was a street that had all these venues for entertainment. So on the weekends, it would be filled with people. The sidewalk would just be crowded. So we'd run down there with our Rebel Worker and start hawking it in the streets. And it was a great experience, just especially talking to young people who identified greatly with the fact that we were opposed to work. And then through that we met a whole number of people who were influenced, I think, by our politics. So it wasn't that we were trying to recruit people, but we had this sense of being involved and in introducing ourselves into the world, not simply sitting back and waiting for people to come to us. So I think that's also a sort of anarchist way of acting and a way of being in the world. You just don't sit there in your comfortable chair and write and hope somebody's going to read your stuff, but you actually go out there and either do things in terms of like the Catholic Worker, or you present yourself as a person into the actual culture that you're surrounded by and trying to change it. And of course, the Vietnam War was increasingly an issue, and so being opposed to the war, being opposed to larger issues of the culture itself, the alienation and the conformity that existed in the early 60s, and still continues, for Christ's sake, it provided us a way of being present in the world that was kind of unique, I think. Because, I mean, there were other political groups that would go out to demonstrations and hawk their little magazines and so forth, but they were trying to recruit people. They weren't trying to actually change minds, except to change minds to their way of thinking. But we were, so we were doing that for a while. But after a period of about 2 years, the original group around the bookstore started going in different directions. And I went off to Buffalo. It seemed strange, but I went to the University of Buffalo, partly because I had been there before, because there was a very active SDS group there. I met some people. But that experience in Buffalo brought me closer to another aspect of rebelliousness in American culture, because I met there and stayed and lived in a co-op house with a bunch of poets who were very close to the Black Mountain poets in the 50s and 60s, and so that influence brought me a better appreciation of American culture in terms of its not only its literary history but its connection to American capitalism. Charles Olson, for example, wrote this long poem about Moby Dick and the rise of the whaling industry. And the whaling industry in America was the first really global industry. It was, I mean, obviously you're roaming the seas, catching these whales and blubber and whale oil. This was a major resource in the 1800s, actually even in the 17th century, 18th century, I mean, but throughout the 19th century, the whaling industry was huge. It was only after mechanization and the Industrial Revolution started to creep in that it lost its presence as a major industry. But who was Ahab? But the ultimate maniac capitalist. I mean, you could say Ahab was Elon Musk is today's Ahab. Just a totally crazy maniac, stricken with the well, I'm not going to go into details of this, but I think you understand what I'm trying to say here. There's a certain rebelliousness in American culture against the certain craziness that exists in terms of how the economy is structured and what it means for people's lives and how depleted those lives can be. So after that one semester in Buffalo, which I spent most of my time in the library reading literature, reading the poetry of the Black Mountain poets. The Black Mountain, I should say, maybe people don't know, Black Mountain was also an independent collection of intellectuals and students, and I think it was North Carolina, if I'm not mistaken. And the poets that came out of that were the how do I put this? They were the most like Walt Whitman, for example. They were the poets of the American rebelliousness that they carried forward, and some of them were actually had a kind of a working class, well, not kind of a working class background, and that resonated with me. And so anyway, so I came back to Chicago after Buffalo, and went back to Roosevelt. So I got back in late 67, fall of 67. In 68, I was at Roosevelt again, and Staunton Lynn was teaching at Roosevelt. Staunton Lynn, you may know, is a labor historian to begin with, became a lawyer when he couldn't teach anymore. He was at Roosevelt because he lost his teaching job. I'm not sure if it was at Princeton or it was at a prestigious university. He got booted out because of his politics. And he went to Roosevelt in his last attempt at being a college professor, and he got booted out at Roosevelt for his anti-war activities and so forth. So a bunch of us students took up his cause and occupied one of the administrative offices, boarded ourselves inside in 68. Now, May 68 in France was, of course, blowing up, and people in Columbia were occupying schools. It was kind of like what happened here last year with the rebelliousness against the genocide going on in Palestine, and schools all over were being occupied. Our occupation was in favor of getting Staunton Lynn back at the college. But we locked ourselves in this room of 12 of us. We barricaded ourselves in there. We all got busted and got felony charges and thrown into jail. Luckily, the school didn't press our felony charges, but being thrown in jail for basically, again, the First Amendment right to free speech resonated with me and still does. But So then I dropped out of school again. I should say that I've been to almost every junior college in Chicago and every school in Chicago, even the University of Chicago for a while. In fact, when I was in the Student Peace Union, I was in Hyde Park because that's where the main Student Peace Union was located. And that's where I got in touch with the Young People's Socialist League and discovered what democratic socialism was all about. And it totally turned me off. But I was there the same time Bernie was, the famous Bernie, not me. And of course, I didn't remember him. I mean, he would have probably been a freshman because I got there about the same time. He would have been a freshman, I think. I was 18 when I joined the Student Peace Union. And I went to some meetings and met these Democratic Socialists and YPSO people, YPSO Young People's Socialist League, which was what he was a part of. He went on to an activist activity within the civil rights movement, whereas I gravitated more towards the peace movement and against the war. So anyway, when I left Roosevelt after Staunton Lynn episode, a friend of mine had set up a print shop. It was a co-op shop, not a worker co-op shop, but a co-op shop based on political people in Chicago pooling their finances to buy the equipment, and they were basically the co-op was these people who owned the shop of a sort, and their worker was my friend Ken. But Ken realized that the shop was too small where it was, and so he wanted to expand it. And just coincidentally, was looking for work, so he taught me how to print basically. So here it was, the summer of '68, learning how to print, and the Democratic Convention was happening in Chicago that time. We had already met the Yippies. They had come to the bookshop group to recruit us into the Yippie movement. We all thought they were crazy. We said, you can't come to Chicago and fight the police in Chicago. They'll just murder you. And they didn't kill one Yippie, but they didn't listen to us. Several people I know in Chicago left Chicago during the convention because they were afraid the cops would crash them, set them, jail them. The Young Lords, the Puerto Rican, the equivalent to the Black Panthers in the Puerto Rican community, were active in our neighborhood in the Old Town area, and they stayed. And they didn't want to ally with the Yippies, but they were certainly against the war and wanted to demonstrate. But we didn't want to be involved with recruiting people that come to Chicago because they knew how bad the Chicago police were. And we didn't want to be responsible for bringing innocent people, into the park. Anyway, so I'm learning how to print. The Yippies need political folders, so I'm there during the day at the shop printing all the Yippie literature. My friend Ken, who was twice my size, and rode a motorcycle, had a motorcycle helmet, and had a big baseball bat, would go to Grant Park while the Yippies were congregated and be the ad hoc defense of the Yippie movement with a couple of other, football types who would show up. And I was there during the day printing all this Yippie literature. And then at night, I would go to Lincoln Park. One night, actually, I didn't get involved with the Yippies so much, but there were a lot of people milling about. It's interesting that when the Yippies came to Chicago, the people who actually allied with them, but not in a formal way, were the gangs. The gangs saw these Yippies as fighting the cops, and they wanted to fight the cops. So actually, the people who fought the cops the most were the greasers in Chicago, the gang kids. It was really hilarious. Anyway, so we were at one point where we're standing on the corner across from Lincoln Park, and the squad car, there were squad cars flying around all over, but this one made a mistake and went up a cul-de-sac, and somebody from the park, I guess, threw a brick or something or a stone at him. He jumped out of his car, and like a nut, like a total crazed guy, he drew his gun and started firing crazily, not at where the brick came from, or I never saw the brick or the stone. I just knew that I heard the noise when his car was maybe half a block or so from where I was standing with a group of people. As I said, not in the park, but his gunfire was so crazy that it was hitting the building we were standing next to. So then we all took off and ran like crazy. And then at that point, we thought, okay, so we're running, so we're going to have the cops chasing us. And I mean, Chicago at that point was really besieged by. You didn't need the National Guard, though they did show up later. But the Chicago police were just like a a gang of armed thugs. That's what they were. And so when we got involved in a couple of demonstrations downtown, it was just it's brutal. Those of us who from Chicago knew what was happening would sort of stay back and not put ourselves in the front lines. But a lot of unfortunate kids, especially even kids who were not even yippies, were part of the Democratic Convention, were delegates, young kids, young people, I should say, who were delegates in supporting, the opposition to the Humphrey in the Democratic Convention. At the Democratic Convention, were sometimes in these demonstrations right in the front and getting beaten by the cops. And anyway, so much for that. The shop continued for a while with Ken and myself. We printed much of the literature from Solidarity Bookshop was printed at that shop. Tor Fagery produced an anarchist calendar every year. We printed that every year for about, I think there were 6 issues from 6. The first issue was mimeographed. After that, they were printed on a press. So I think there were 6 issues of the anarchist calendar. I could show you some of this stuff, but I'm not prepared to. I have copies of it. But we existed for a while doing commercial work and just a lot of political work. We printed, for example, some literature for students in local high schools. A lot of the stuff we did semi-free or donations. Luckily, we had some commercial work which kept us going. But after about another 2 years of that, I'm a real butterfly. I can't stand doing the same thing for too long, I guess. So I got tired of doing that. And Ken went off, and I was stuck there alone at the shop. I took on an apprentice and taught him how to print. But I was getting bored with it. At that point, this group from the East Coast showed up. And I had sort of some acquaintance with situationist literature. Rebel Worker published actually the first translation of a situationist text in the United States, the text a text called Unitary Urbanism. And so, even though I was familiar with surrealism and had appreciation of its provocative nature, the situationists seemed to be more current. Their article essay on the Watts Rebellion, for example, was just superb. It grabbed the sense of festival that was the Watts Rebellion, and that existed almost. Even the most diehard demonstration, like opposed to wars and so forth, there's a sense of festivity in those demonstrations because people are together. They're organized and working towards one goal, and that's a festive kind of feeling to be involved with. To not be alone, to be involved in a group, a common goal. So they picked up on that, and I thought that was really important, that they didn't simply focus on the politics of the issue, but saw the larger cultural issues involved. So the group that came to Evanston, when the print shop was near Evanston, eventually they came to the shop, and I met them. There were Pro Situs, situationists from the East Coast. I got involved with them because they were my venue, my ticket to get out of the print shop. And I went to Cambridge with them. There was a love affair involved, so I was attracted to one of the women involved in the group. And that, obviously, having a love affair and also being involved with a group that was doing something interesting drew me to Cambridge. So I spent 5 or 6 months in Cambridge. This was in '70. That's when Kent State happened. Kent State killing of students. I came back to Chicago after that love affair broke up, and their view of activity was a little bizarre. They would sort of intrude themselves into political groups and encourage them in a not so great way to be more radical, as radical like them. They went off the deep end, I understand later, when after I left, they went to New York and became a kind of a cult, which was true of what I later found out to be much of the prostitute stuff in California when I moved to California. But anyway, so I went back to Chicago. I had printing experience, so I started working at a couple of print shops. And I actually, this is a strange story, but I became an honorary member of the Women's Graphics Collective in Chicago because I produced the film they needed for their silkscreen productions in the print shop I was working at in Hyde Park. Of course, I did it all, surreptitiously, and they got their film free. But until they got set up with a better situation in terms of a lithographic camera and so forth, providing their film for their posters. Um, uh, then I met Ann, woman I'm living with now, my house. I'm from Chicago to San Francisco, since I'd been to San Francisco several times. I was in San Francisco in 67. That's 67, 65, I think it was, when the poets in San Francisco at City Lights were all in the IWW. We came out here. So I moved to San Francisco, but Ann didn't, and she wanted to see America. So we drove out here, drove back to New York where I had friends. And then she went back to France to straighten out her citizenship in terms of being married to an American. I went back to Chicago, got another job at another print shop. And then eventually we both moved out to San Francisco, where I had some friends and got involved with John Zerzan at first. John and Paul Zerzan were our friends. This is before John became a primitive anarchist, which I, saw again as a kind of a cult. This my view of, cult activities in the political spectrum really comes out of my Catholic background, because I think the Catholic Church is just a glorified cult, and most religions are, in my opinion. Not that there aren't people doing good things in churches and so forth, and it can be a way in which people can actually connect with their community. So I don't put that down, but in terms of religious fanaticism, it's so apparent that it comes out of that kind of milieu. It can. It's just so tempting to become a raving maniac and shoot people because they're for abortions and stuff. So I saw the situationists here in California as again a kind of a cult, but there are other people doing work here in terms like Food Not Bombs. Met David Solnit. David Solnit, the brother of Rebecca Solnit, was having these anarchist get-togethers at his house in San Francisco. So I met Food Not Bombs people there. I met people involved with the political movement, the anarchist movement in San Francisco, which goes back to the origins of City Lights. I mean, the origins of City Lights is really basically an anarchist project in many ways. So the city also drew the sense of rebelliousness. This is even before the hippies, the Beats and so forth were in San Francisco. So it was only natural that there'd be a big anarchist milieu here in San Francisco area. And that's where I met Chris Carlson, and who just was beginning. Actually, he was involved with the Concerned Commies, and they did, like the San Francisco Mime Trip, they did guerrilla theater. And I remember going to Golden Gate Park and being a part of their guerrilla theater operation, uh, which was, unlike the San Francisco Mime Troupe, they didn't have venues set up, they didn't have everything set up and structured. They would just show up and do a skit, and whoever was there would get involved. So there was this draw of people because they were doing this, and they did it as long as they weren't kicked out of the park or were just bored with what they were doing and stopped. But so that brings me up to San Francisco, and my activity there at the beginning with people around Bound Together Books and so forth. But I eventually got a job working in Palo Alto in a print shop, and at that point, that was already the early '80s. Um, the Berlin Wall was collapsing, but just before the Berlin Wall collapsed, there was a rebellion in Poland with the workers in Poland at the Gdansk shipyards. And I come from a Polish American background. My parents were born, my father was born in Wisconsin. My mother was born in Poland, came here as a child, came to the States as a child. So I didn't really have any connections with Polish culture in any way, except that I grew up within a community, a family that had remnants of Polish, food and cultural activities. And my father's family was huge. Um, and so I kind of adopted that I understood what that Polish culture was about. But when Poland erupted and workers erupted in Poland, I saw this as an anarcho-syndicalist rebellion. And so I got involved in finding out what was going on, got more and more involved. And in England, there was a journal called Labor Focus. Labor Focus carried daily, um, the daily, we reproduced the daily newsletter of the workers who were barricaded inside the shipyard. And that daily bulletin was like it had all the earmarks of good fiction in the sense that it was so dramatic. I mean, here the people were, they expected to be shot at and killed, really, because the army was outside. But there were so many of them, hundreds of them, inside the shipyards, and closed it down. The shipyards in Gdansk were huge. This was a major, for all of the Soviet Union and the satellite states, this was a major shipyard in that economic sector. So this was a very serious rebellion. So I got more and more involved in it. I do have this actually, I could show you. So you can see this book, Polish August. So this book was made of all the journal entries in the newsletter that the workers put together. And I worked at this print shop in Palo Alto. One of the owners, there was four owners, one of the owners was Latvian. So he knew it came out of, East European background, was very sympathetic to the concerns of the workers in Poland. And being one of the owners, they let me use the equipment there to typeset the book. I used the bindery system that they had developed. They printed the book at the shop. Under cost, really. It was basically a gift. And it got me to realize, what having a huge commercial print shop, it wasn't huge, but it was well equipped. I think how many of us, so there may be 10 or 12 of us working there, but had all the equipment you would need to produce, all kinds of fine literature. And it was, Palo Alto, which is Silicon Valley. So they had all the early tech stuff coming their way. So it was a very prosperous shop. And it had all this equipment. So I made use of it, and I produced this book basically on their dime, which was a revelation to me. And at that point, I found some people in San Francisco area, Berkeley mainly, who were also involved in supporting the democratic movement in Poland. and in Eastern Europe. Long story short, we started producing a magazine called Across Frontiers. I became the production editor because I had access to the printing equipment in Palo Alto. A friend of mine, Peter, got involved in the editorial work because he had contacts with the Democratic Socialists who were, of course, allied with the socialists in Eastern Europe who were, fighting the communist regime. And then, of course, the wall collapsed. And so that made it all more important for us to publish something that gave voice to the democratic dissidents in Eastern Europe. This was before the wall, but you could see it was going to collapse. The movement was, the dissident movements in Czech Republic, for example, Hungary, all over Eastern Europe. So we gave it voice and produced 10 issues or so of that magazine. And again, this was my printing background that made it possible for me to produce this literature. There's a history here of it's not just Proudhon who was a printer. There were anarchist printers and rebellious printers throughout the political movement and historically. It wouldn't be unusual to find a political person who knew how to print or involved in typesetting, for example. So I'll go on here and continue with my story. So I worked at that print shop for quite a few years, 13 years, and moved from San Francisco to Berkeley because I was raising a family. I brought my mother from Chicago to Berkeley. We bought a house that had an in-law apartment. So here I was in Berkeley commuting all the way to San Francisco. So it was, quite a commute. San Francisco to Palo Alto commute was not bad because a train ride for an hour, but I could read. So I read for an hour on the way to Palo Alto. The way back, I'd read for another hour on the train. And it took less than half an hour to drive from the train station to my home, to my apartment in San Francisco. So I had 2 hours of straight reading every day. I didn't mind that. When I moved to Berkeley, that got to be a little bit of a stress. So I asked if I could work 4 days a week and took off Friday so to have a 3-day weekend. They were cool with that. But then after a while, I thought, this is nuts. And so I left that place, worked at a few print shops in the East Bay. And then one day I drove by this print shop that I knew was set up by Stalinists, or let's call them Marxist-Leninists to be more polite. Finally, I decided to drop in and see if they needed someone, though I really didn't expect to want to work there, given what I knew about the place, these Marxist-Leninists. Well, it turns out when I walked in, their jaws dropped because they were looking for someone who had my pre-press experience. They practically wanted to hire me on the spot. But they had to do a background check. Turns out that actually, even though the founders of Inkworks Press, which was what it was called, were Marxist-Leninists of one sort, they found out later that they were Marxist-Leninists more what can I say? They kind of wore that as a patina on their lives. It was like what they thought they had to be rebellious and serious at the same time. But of course, not being serious and being rebellious, I didn't have much reason to truck with any Leninist bullshit. So it turns out that when they were trying to find skilled people, they were hiring lesbians. Well, the lesbians weren't Marxist-Leninists. In fact, the first lesbian they hired was a Trotskyist. So here they had to kind of open their minds to something other than their sort of comfortable political outlook. And they hired 2 more lesbians, and then they hired me because even though I was an anarchist, and they checked on my references in Chicago, they checked references in Chicago to determine that I was an anarchist, because their Marxist-Leninist friends in Chicago said, "Yep, he's an anarchist. He was involved with the Saturday bookshop." Well, it was choosing an anarchist who had skills or just not having anyone to fill this position, they decided they'd have to hire us anarchists. So they hired me. It was kind of funny because when I discovered later that their Marxist-Leninism was really very skin deep, it it they never heard of Kronstadt, for example. It was a revelation to me that these are people who are Leninists and never heard of Kronstadt. So, but they were a worker co-op, and they had actually the the most radical sense of what a worker co-op could be. First of all, they joined a union when they formed. And when you join a union, a printers union, just the skilled people are in the union. They wanted everybody in the union, the front end, everybody. So that was one thing that was very strange. Everyone was in the union. Everybody working there had the same pay schedule. Turned out that our shop, our worker co-op shop, was similar to Rainbow Grocery, which also had a flat salary schedule, and also similar to Cheese Board. So the three of us were the largest worker co-ops in the area. We formed a federation of worker co-ops in called No Boss. It stood for the network of worker co-ops, East Bay of San Francisco worker co-ops. East Bay worker co-ops, Bay Area worker co-ops. Sorry, No Boss. So that's how I got involved with the worker co-op movement, and been involved sort of with that rest of my life, which I see basically as an anarchist endeavor, even though the co-ops aren't necessarily, they don't have any political stance. But given that the fact that these are institutions that are set up independent of the state, independent of financing by a private entity, but financed through the benefits of those who work, through the benefits of people who work there, through the money raised by the people who work in the institution. Worker co-ops are in fact like a small commons. It's the people who work the commons who benefit from the commons. They really don't own it in the sense that they have ownership rights, they have membership rights. They're members of the co-op of the commons, and that's how worker co-ops exist. So that's kind of, it brings me up to date and brings me to my most recent book, which I want to plug a bit because it's kind of the culmination of what I've been doing. And I'll show you this. That's the book. And the reason I'm bringing this up at the end here is because I think the worker co-ops are actually the best avenue for creating a resistance to climate change and resource depletion, because they're organized, and they're organized across the country, and they're independent. And they also have a very democratic structure. And if we're going to solve the issues that are involved with climate change, and so forth, I think we need that kind of democratic structure. And so I'm hoping that my research into neuroscience and the explanation of what it means to have an education that's based on input by the people who are being educated, free education, like Summerhill, which was an anarchist school in England, which was a free school for kids. That kind of education that leads to living a life, giving yourself the opportunity to be with peers and cultivate the peer relationships. That's a cultural change in terms of no top-down kind of boss relationship, but a relationship working with people you respect and who are your peers. That's essential. We're not going to deal with climate change and resource depletion. In fact, the collapse of civilization, unless we change the culture. The culture has got to be based on these values, the democratic peer values. So that's the conclusion of my little monologue here. Thank you. I think that we need a cultural rebellion, and it's necessary. So, and that book I wrote is really for people of your generation, because you're the people who are going to make this change happen. And you have to understand how that change is really part of your species being. I mean, it's part of the way you need to operate, daily in your life. So good luck.